Tchaikovsky is one of the most famously brilliant conjurers of orchestral magic. His scores are packed with precisely drawn pictures and vibrant colours. He's a composer who really knows his way around the orchestra and knows in intimate detail what each instrument is capable of. So I was genuinely shocked to learn that one of the most famous moments in one of his most celebrated works, the harp cadenza in the Waltz of the Flowers from the ballet The Nutcracker, isn't actually what Tchaikovsky originally wrote. To the confusion of many a conductor, the score still shows the part Tchaikovsky wrote, but no harpist ever actually plays that. They play a rewritten, rearranged version. I was playing the Waltz of the Flowers by Tchaikovsky with the Dutch Youth Orchestra, says harpist Tana Harder. This part has a harp cadenza at the beginning, which is also one of the most familiar orchestral excerpts in our repertoire. I received the original part from the orchestra, but when I brought this to my lesson, my teacher told me that that's not how we play it, and she handed me a few different options that she'd gathered over the years. When I played this arrangement of the cadenza, the conductor asked me after the first rehearsal why we never played this how it's written, and the only answer I could give him was that nobody does it, and that it just doesn't really fit the harp. It's a story that I think offers some consolation to us artists. So much of what we inherit from history comes to us in this refined, perfected and polished form. As a creative person, it can feel quite intimidating. How could these artists, these great composers, just come out with such perfectly crafted artworks where there's not a single note out of place? It seems superhuman. So this is a story that I think offers us mere mortals a little glimmer of hope that sometimes even the greats messed up. The harp evolved through a series of quite radical upgrades to get to the instrument that Tchaikovsky would have known. It started out life as a diatonic instrument. Think of it like the white notes on the piano, the 7 notes A to G, which repeat up the octaves. But right from the start, the need for chromatic notes presented a challenge for harp designers. Renaissance harpists tended to press the hand at the top of the harp to make the occasional sharp note. But this, of course, was a bit limiting, and you needed your second hand to make the change, so it was only good for very specific cases. By Monteverdi's time in the early 17th century, harps were basically double the size and had 3 rows of strings. The outer 2 on each side were still the white notes, but in between them ran the black notes, and you had to reach in between the outer strings to play them. So it was a fully chromatic instrument, but it was only really suited to a few keys. You wouldn't want to try to play a piece in F-sharp major on this instrument. Then in the 1760s there was a new approach. The first pedal harps were invented. Mozart wrote for one in his Flute and Harp Concerto. Each string is attached by a mechanism that runs down the column to the pedals below, so each string can now play a natural and a sharp version of each note. This was a great improvement, but composers were writing increasingly chromatic music, and a more comprehensive solution was needed. So at the start of the 19th century, Sebastian Erard patented the first double-action pedal harps.
Old one, new one.
These added a second disc to the mechanism, meaning each string could be used in one of 3 positions.
Flat and sharp now becomes flat, natural and sharp.
Berlioz has one of the earliest significant double-action harp parts in his Symphonie Fantastique, but he found performances quite frustrating, particularly in Germany, where it was hard to find performers good enough to play the challenging part. The harp was still a new instrument, and it hadn't yet established itself as a permanent member of the orchestra. By the time of Tchaikovsky, there were 2 competing models for the full chromatic harp. The double action harp that we've seen and the chromatic harp, which is cross-strung with 2 sets of strings so that each chromatic note can be played by each hand. This eventually led to a bit of a competition between the rival manufacturers and the commission of 2 of the most famous pieces for the harp. Danse sacrée et profane by Claude Debussy, written for the cross-strung chromatic harp, and the Introduction and Allegro by Maurice Ravel, written for the double-action harp. Those 2 pieces and those composers did a lot to finally establish the harp in the orchestral lineup, and of the 2 it was the pedal harp that won out. The Ravel in particular is packed with examples of just how versatile an instrument the harp is. It uses a full range of textures, effects like the use of harmonics, and unlike Tchaikovsky, who almost exclusively uses the harp just for chords and arpeggios, here there are plenty of genuine harp melodies. But ironically enough, as we'll see, it was Tchaikovsky himself who also contributed to the harp's reputation, with his 3 major harp cadenzas composed for the 3 ballets Nutcracker, Swan Lake and Sleeping Beauty. But despite the establishment of the harp's place within the orchestra, it remains to this day a challenging instrument for composers to write for, and the fact that no one plays what Tchaikovsky originally wrote suggests that even he grappled with the complexities of the instrument. So, what exactly did Tchaikovsky get wrong in this cadenza? Well, here's a list of 6 of the most common things composers get wrong when writing for the harp, and see if you can guess how many of them Tchaikovsky himself failed on. Okay, first up, it's the no pinky rule. Unbeknownst to many a composer over the years, harpists don't use all their fingers, they only use 4 fingers per hand. This means that chords and arpeggios for the harp need to be built around patterns with a maximum of 4 notes. If you're a composer or arranger, try giving the harpist 5 notes per hand and watch them secretly give you a death stare. Thankfully, Tchaikovsky did know this one. Even the ballet Swan Lake from over 10 years earlier was meticulous in its use of arpeggios with a maximum of 4 notes per hand. And Nutcracker is just the same, all the arpeggios use 4-note patterns. This one's a tick. Well done, Piotr. Number 2, finger torture. Unlike the piano where the hands are symmetrical, on the harp both hands are arranged in the same direction with the biggest gap higher up in the register. Any chords or arpeggios with a big gap at the bottom will be difficult, uncomfortable, painful, or even dangerous. Tchaikovsky flunked this one with the very last chord of the cadenza. It's an A7 with a 5th in the bass. Harpists have had to come up with various workarounds or alternatives, but that also leaves you open to the dangers of number 3, getting stuck in the mud. The lower range of the harp is somewhat unfocused, meaning if you write too many notes down here, well, it gets muddy. This one's another Tchaikovsky fail. The opening arpeggio starts with 4 notes right down here in the bass of the harp. Missing out a few of these, as most harpists now do, makes it sound a lot less gloopy. That one's fairly minor, but there's a second section which is considerably worse. Mud, glorious mud. In fact, there's something else wrong with this section, and that's number 4, note overload. For fast passages, it tends to be better to interlock the 2 hands, and definitely not have both hands playing fast arpeggios simultaneously. This is actually probably the biggest whopper in the whole cadenza. Tchaikovsky's original version has arpeggios in contrary motion in both hands, moving at a fast pace throughout. Harder here is playing the original Tchaikovsky version. You might think it sounds okay, but it's all about the flow and the tempo that this passage really needs to go at. Tana herself says it's not clear why Tchaikovsky wrote a pattern like this. It's very unidiomatic, and on the harp it doesn't have the same flow as if you would play it on the piano. This passage involved the most radical rewrite. Albert Zabel, who was the harpist in the original performance of the Nutcracker, completely redid this, missing out the contrary motion altogether and instead splitting out the arpeggio into 2 hands. The result is infinitely more smooth and flowing, as you'll hear towards the end of this clip by Tana Harder. Another way notes can overload is when they step on each other's toes, and this happens when they are repeated.
The harpist has to pre-place a note before actually playing it. So when we have repeated notes, especially faster repeated notes, that doesn't give us time to replace. So there's always going to be a little hiccup in the music if we're playing repeated notes.
Unfortunately, Tchaikovsky fails here too. He doesn't do the schoolboy error of repeated fast notes in one hand, but after the long passage of arpeggios, we reach what should be the climax of the cadenza. This should be a fast upward arpeggio, but some of the left-hand notes are the same as the right-hand. So instead of preparing the notes by placing the finger on the string, as Danielle was mentioning there, the harpist is forced to wait until the very last minute to place the right hand on the string. This makes performing this passage clunky and prone to failure. Oh, and by the way, the very top A that Tchaikovsky wrote there also doesn't exist on the harp. Zabel went all out on the rewrite here, replacing it with, depending on your taste, a stylish or cheesy zigzagging glissando. Others just use a simple arpeggio split between the two hands. And finally, number 6, we come to the pedals. While the pedal harp won out the battle of the chromatic harps, it does still very much have its challenges. It requires a moment to change the pedal, and if the music is too chromatic, it can be difficult to change all the pedals quickly enough. Wagner, of course, was a famously chromatic composer, and the fire music from the opera Die Walküre has some extreme pedal changes which are verging on impossible to play. But Tchaikovsky was a far less chromatic composer than Wagner, and in fact the whole cadenza doesn't even require a single pedal change apart from the F natural in the penultimate bar. So by default this one is a tick. So if we add all of these up, Tchaikovsky failed on 4 of the 6, so it's a dismal 33%. Even amongst the 2 he got right, 1, the successful pedalling, was just because there was basically no pedalling needed. So the no pinky rule is the one genuine piece of knowledge that Tchaikovsky had about harp writing. Not so much a fail as a harpocalypse. The big question, of course, is why? Why did such a monumental talent as Tchaikovsky make so many rookie errors? It was time to do a bit of investigation. We might be tempted to look to Albert Zabel. We've heard that he was the harpist who premiered the Nutcracker, as well as Sleeping Beauty a couple of years earlier. He was the principal harpist of the Mariinsky Theatre, and he seems to have developed a habit or an inclination to revise composers' scores, convinced that composers lacked a proper understanding of the specifics of his instrument. In the introduction to his unfortunately titled book, A Word to Gentlemen Composers About the Practical Application of the Harp in the Orchestra, he wrote, "First of all, I must point out that we harpists are often struck by the following fact. Upon receiving a new orchestral part written for the harp nowadays, we can immediately predict that the performer will need to arrange or even completely redo it, as it would otherwise be impossible to play." The accounts I managed to find in English language documents all made the working assumption that Tchaikovsky simply bowed to Zabel's superior knowledge, and that was that. He did apparently once call him an artist whom I highly respect. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Was the situation driven, for example, by any kind of antipathy or condescension on Tchaikovsky's part towards the instrument? But try as I might, I could find no further mention of Tchaikovsky's views on the harp. I decided to make one last attempt. I asked ChatGPT to help frame the question in Russian. I asked it, translate into Russian, Tchaikovsky's attitude towards the harp. It gave me this phrase, which I then typed into Google Scholar, the side of Google which lets you search academic articles, and up popped a Russian language document by Maria Fedorova. More ChatGPT translation back into English, and I finally came across this quote from Tchaikovsky himself, originally apparently from a work titled The Harp in the Past and Present by I.A. Polomarenko. Now, without visiting Moscow, which doesn't seem very likely anytime soon, I can't verify this further, but here's the quote attributed to Tchaikovsky. "The harp is an instrument of extraordinary timbral beauty, which lends a poetic quality to the sound of the orchestra, but it cannot be an independent instrument because it entirely lacks melodic qualities and is only suitable for harmony. True, harpists like Parish Alvars write fantasies for it based on operas, including melodies, but this is a stretch. Chords and arpeggios, this is the narrow realm of the harp, thus it is only suitable as an accompaniment. This, I have to say, is rather shocking, and I'm very sorry to any harpists who didn't realise quite how much of a harpogynist Tchaikovsky was. But truth be told, it does tie in with Tchaikovsky's approach to the harp in the three ballets, which was very much arpeggios, chords, and nothing much else. It suggests a rather blinkered view of the instrument, which is frankly a little disappointing. How strange it is, though, that these three solos in the three ballets form such a major part of the harp repertoire, and no doubt for an awful lot of people, an introduction and first prolonged exposure to the magical sounds of the harp. That is the genius part of Tchaikovsky at work. The harp moments within the ballets are true events that arrive just at the right time, where time stops for a moment and we enter another realm. True, the harp becomes just a colour. In all three ballets, it's just an introduction, not part of the main musical idea. It's just arpeggios and chords. But it is still an incredibly poignant and beautiful introduction because of how and where Tchaikovsky sets it up within the structure of the piece. So what we have here is a fascinating paradox, an iconic moment in ballet and in harp repertoire that fixes the harp in the mind, and played a not insignificant role in establishing the harp as a regular in the orchestral lineup, but written by a composer who viewed the instrument as beautiful, yes, but of mostly decorative or secondary importance. So that's the end of the main part of the video, but having dissed on Tchaikovsky, it seems only fair to show you a few examples of my own compositions for harp. Here are 5 pieces which have varying degrees of success. Scores for all of these are available to view over on my Patreon. I think my first use of harp was in a piece I got to workshop as a student with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and this had 2 harps in it. It was a nice opening texture, but look over here, I found a repeated note. Impossible to play at this tempo. 10 years later, I wrote an opera called A Bird in Your Ear. Some good stuff in this, but a really bad passage for harp here that contains 5-note arpeggios, very tricky lines in both hands, and even some fast repeated notes. So a triple fail, really. I did write the whole 1-hour opera in 3 months, so I'll give myself a bit of leeway. I got to meet harpist BRIDGET KIBBEY in New York around this time. And with her help, I really got to know the harp a whole lot better. This groovy line in my piece, The North Wind Was a Woman, is intricate and fast-paced, but works well for the harp, I think. I wrote BRIDGET a solo harp piece called Caja de Musica, which is released on her album Crossing the Ocean, which I highly recommend if you want to hear some more great harp music. The last movement of my piece is super fast throughout. It works well, but it also needs a lot of stamina. I think I may have overdone it as a texture, because it's really quite hard. Finally, a more recent piece, The Consolation of Rain. BRIDGET again performing, and a piece where I think I finally successfully write for and integrate the harp into a chamber music setting. The full performance of this piece is available over on Camerata Pacifica's YouTube channel. Just to emphasise, I'm not showing you these to show you how much better of a harp writer I am than Tchaikovsky. I'm not trying to compete on that score, but I hope you found it interesting to just see some of the stuff I've been up to when writing for harp. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Bruce.